When Elijah Hart, the man Hollywood calls strangely kind, stepped onto the stage of the Marcus Dean show, no one in the audience knew they were about to witness something that would forever redefine what a television interview could be. No script, no pre-written dialogue, just one celebrity preparing to take off his final mask. Marcus Dean, with his familiar half-smile and warm gaze, walked out to the familiar theme music and roaring applause. Holding his cue cards, he introduced his guest not by listing accolades, but with something far more profound. Today, we're not just meeting a star, we're meeting a soul, a man who makes the whole world feel like they know him, even if they've never met him. The crowd erupted as Elijah appeared. He wore jeans, a plain black shirt, and a dark blazer. No glamour, no flash, just him. He gave a small wave, smiled softly, then bowed his head slightly, as if to say thank you, but also a bit shy in the face of so much attention. Elijah sat down. The stage lights dimmed slightly, and it felt as if someone had slowed the breathing of the entire room. Marcus began with a few familiar questions about a recent role, about behind-the-scenes moments from an action movie. Elijah answered with his warm, deep voice, humble, unhurried, unshowy. He spoke of his co-stars with genuine respect. He spoke of success with a grateful glint in his eyes. But there was something strange. His gaze slowly drifted toward the cross necklace on Marcus's chest, the one the host always wore as part of himself, but rarely spoke of. And then Elijah broke the flow of conversation with a sentence that brought the room to complete silence. Marcus, may I tell you something? Something I've never shared publicly before. It wasn't a shocking revelation. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a plug for a new film. It was something deeper, more personal, as if it had just been carefully unlatched from a place that had been locked in his heart for a very long time. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply nodded. Elijah took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. He began to speak, slowly. And as he spoke, it was no longer the actor Elijah speaking, but a human being with wounds still healing, pouring his gratitude into every word. He told a story about one night, a night so dark, he wasn't sure he would live to see the morning. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't talk. I wasn't even sure I wanted to live. And then, in the loneliest moment of his life, he scrolled through his phone, a mindless, desperate action, and came across a clip, a short video. It was Marcus Dean, standing on a stage, speaking about pain, speaking about faith, saying, "God doesn't waste pain." Elijah looked at Marcus. "You don't know this, but that night, you saved me." The atmosphere in the studio shifted. No more applause, no more laughter. They held their breath, because this was a story of survival being told with words that were heartbreakingly real. And from that moment on, this interview was no longer just a piece of entertainment. It became a confession, a tribute, and a moment one that millions would later watch again. Not to hear what was said, but to feel what was no longer being hidden. Marcus Dean wasn't just a TV host. He was the kind of person who could make you laugh even when you didn't feel like it. A man who once hustled on comedy club stages, then rose to helm the biggest talk show in America with a wit that always carried weight. People loved Marcus, not just for the jokes, but because in the middle of the laughter, he always left space, a pause deep enough for the tired to exhale, to believe in something again. Elijah Hart was a different story altogether. Unlike most Hollywood stars, Elijah never cared for the spotlight. He rarely attended events. He was almost silent on social media. And yet, he always showed up captured in photos shared millions of times, helping the homeless, offering his seat on the subway, carrying gear for a film crew with his own hands. The media called him Hollywood's last good man. But Elijah never spoke about it. They were two completely different worlds. One stepped out from the stage, the other stepped in, then disappeared. But tonight, those two worlds met. Marcus stepped out to the sound of applause, adjusted his microphone, and gave a soft smile. Tonight, I don't need to say much, because this man, he doesn't have to speak for you to feel who he truly is. The crowd stirred with excitement. Elijah walked out just as people had always seen him, simple, approachable, and slightly out of place, as if the stage lights were too bright for someone who only ever wanted to live quietly. He shook Marcus's hand, bowed to the audience, then took his seat. But at that very moment, Marcus noticed something strange. Unlike other guests, Elijah didn't look around, didn't search for the cameras, didn't perform. His eyes rested right on the necklace Marcus was wearing, a small, worn silver cross. They began to talk. The first question was light. "How have you been lately?" Elijah smiled and replied with a rare kind of hesitation for a televised interview. "I'm still learning to live in the present." Marcus raised an eyebrow. That sounds like the opening line of a self-help book. Elijah chuckled softly, then paused. "No, I'm just being honest." And the audience began to feel something different. Marcus didn't rush to ask another question. There was something in the air that made him sit a little straighter than usual. He was no longer Marcus Dean, the host, with a list of prepared questions. He was simply a man looking at the person across from him, sensing that he was about to hear something sacred. Elijah sat there, hands resting on his thighs. His eyes weren't drawn to the cameras, but locked on to Marcus. And in that very moment, he spoke a sentence that shifted the entire atmosphere of the show. "I know I came here today to be interviewed, but if I may, I'd like to share something I've never told anyone publicly before." A quiet murmur moved through the audience. Marcus nodded. "I'm here, and I'm listening." A long pause followed. Elijah took a deep breath. His hand brushed gently against the collar of his shirt, as if reaching for courage. And then he began. "A few years ago, I hit rock bottom, not the kind people write about in the tabloids, but a place where there was no more light. The entire studio went silent. This was no longer Marcus asking, Elijah answering, but rather a human being was beginning to recount the darkest night of his life to the entire world. And strangely, though hundreds of lights were shining down, everything suddenly seemed to fade. Everything, except for one thing that came into focus more clearly than ever. This wasn't a conversation. It was a journey. A journey that had only just begun. Elijah sat in silence for a few seconds after uttering that first sentence. In the studio, no one moved. No camera clicks, no quiet coughs. Even Marcus, the man who always knew how to fill the silence with wit, sat still. Not because he ran out of questions, but because he knew that interrupting now would mean losing something sacred that had just begun to surface. Elijah took a breath, not rushed, not performed, and began to speak in a low voice that felt like memories slowly returning from somewhere deep inside. I don't remember the exact date, just that the night felt endless. I sat in my room, lights off. I hadn't eaten all day, didn't respond to a single message, couldn't find a reason to get out of bed. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at Marcus, as if he were speaking to just one person. But his words cut through the hundreds of eyes holding their breath and reached straight into the hearts of everyone watching. I had everything people think is supposed to make you happy. A career, money, successful projects, and a shelf full of awards I never quite knew where to put. He let out a soft laugh, a kind of weary, resigned chuckle. But I didn't feel real. I didn't feel like anyone truly saw me. Marcus tilted his head slightly, and his gaze softened. He was no longer the show's host. He was simply a man listening to someone slowly remove layer after layer of their mask. Elijah continued, slowly. That night, I sat for hours in the dark, not really thinking, not sad, not angry, just empty. He placed a hand on his chest. You know that feeling, when you can hear your heartbeat, but you're not sure if you're still alive. Marcus nodded gently, his expression more serious than usual. And in that moment, under the studio lights, they looked like two men sitting somewhere much more private, much more real. Elijah exhaled. I remember picking up my phone not to call anyone. I was trying to find something, anything, to distract me from the numbness in my head. He paused for a moment. His throat moved slightly, as if swallowing a memory too heavy to speak. I didn't find anything. Just news, social media, scandals, smiling faces that I knew were hiding the same kind of tears I was. But then Elijah looked up at Marcus, and in that moment, his gaze softened, as if he had just glimpsed the light from a sacred memory. I saw you. The entire room froze. A video, not long, no fancy lights, no emotional background music, just you standing alone on a stage, holding a microphone, your other hand on your chest right where that cross is now. Elijah pointed to Marcus's chest, where the silver necklace still shimmered under the lights. You were speaking about faith, about pain, about why the broken ones are the ones God chooses to carry hope. Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe. His hand instinctively gripped the cross around his neck, as if trying to find his way back to himself. Elijah spoke softly. Almost in a whisper, I watched it 3 times in a row, not because it changed me instantly, but because it made me want to change. The audience didn't move. Some had begun wiping their eyes, but no one made a sound. because they knew if they interrupted this moment, they'd be breaking something far greater than just a story. And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed. Elijah leaned back slightly, his eyes blinking slow as if reliving that very moment, not because I was healed, but because I had been seen, not as an actor, but as a human being, in pain, but still holding on to hope. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes carrying something reverent, and the one who gave me that hope was you. Marcus couldn't speak. He simply bowed his head, then placed his hand on his chest once more, not out of habit, but because he knew something holier than words had just happened on that stage. Elijah looked at Marcus for a long time. In his gaze, there was reverence, but also something fragile, as if this famous man was still holding himself together, even after revealing a part of his truth. "Have you ever scrolled through your phone mindlessly?" Elijah asked, his voice deep and deliberate. Marcus smiled gently, nodding. "Every day." Elijah exhaled. "Me too. But that night, I wasn't scrolling for entertainment. I was scrolling to find a reason to stay alive for just a few more minutes." Those words fell into the studio like a soft blade, no blood drawn. But everyone felt the pain. I wasn't looking for anything specific, didn't expect anything. I just thought, if there was an image, a sound, a face, something, anything that could make me feel like I still existed. He paused, not because he lost his words, but because that memory, though in the past, was still pulsing in his chest. And then your video appeared. Elijah inhaled, and it was as if the air itself slowed down. At first, I was going to scroll past it. It didn't have a flashy thumbnail, no clickbait caption, no background music, no color grading, just a man standing on a stage, one hand holding a microphone, the other placed on his chest. He looked at Marcus as if that image was still vivid in his mind. "And then you said, 'God doesn't waste pain.'" The words were spoken softly, but in the silence, they rang like a bell. Marcus bowed his head, silent. Elijah continued, his voice quieter now. "I didn't understand it right away. I just remember I stopped. I looked into your eyes in that video. They didn't say, 'Be strong.' They didn't say, 'It'll be okay.' They just saw me." He placed his hand on his chest, directly opposite the silver cross that lay on Marcus's. I felt like, for the first time, someone didn't want me to push through, but simply wanted me to be seen. Not as a star, not as an actor failing at real life, but as a human being falling. He paused, then smiled. But the smile was wet. I watched that video 3 times in a row, not because it said something profound, but because it didn't try to teach me anything. It just existed, like a small light, like someone in the darkness, quietly turning on a lamp without knowing who might be watching. Marcus brought a hand to his mouth, saying nothing. The entire room remained still, as if even the slightest sound might shatter the sacredness of what was being held. Elijah went on, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was one thing you said in that video that I've never forgotten. If you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. The words echoed not in volume, but in truth. I don't remember everything you said, but that sentence, it was like a rope. It didn't pull me out of the pit, but it gave me a reason not to let go. Marcus lifted his head, eyes glistening, but he didn't speak. He knew if anything needed to be said in this moment, it didn't belong to him. Elijah looked down at his hands. His palms trembled slightly. The next morning, I got up, not because I was stronger, not because I was healed, but because I knew someone who didn't even know me still chose to send out a light. He looked back at Marcus once more. His voice was no longer that of an actor, no longer that of a survivor. It was the voice of someone returning a gift they once received. And today, I just want to say, thank you for turning on the light. Elijah bowed his head for a long moment. He said nothing. His hands folded together, his thumbs gently rubbing over his wrist in an unconscious motion, as if trying to soothe something within himself. The room still held its sacred silence. Then he looked up. There was no more shyness. And it wasn't strength either. It was rawness, as if, after all these years, he was finally ready to face the thing that almost broke him. I used to think I was used to loss. He paused, his eyes drifting into the distance, his voice softening. Because I've been losing things since I was a child. Elijah spoke not with drama, but with the kind of truth that doesn't need embellishment. My father left when I was still a kid. I lived with my mum and little sister, moving from place to place. No house ever felt like home. No school ever really felt like mine. I learned how to pack quickly, got used to people not sticking around. Marcus listened, his hand still gripping the cross. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to comfort. He knew what Elijah needed right now wasn't sympathy, but space to be real. When I was 17, my little sister was diagnosed with leukemia. I spent the next 2 years in hospitals, dropped out of school, worked side jobs, stayed up all night not out of obligation but because I was terrified of waking up one morning. And she'd be gone. He swallowed hard. But then she got better, like a miracle. The entire room seemed to breathe out with relief. But Elijah shook his head, and instantly the weight returned to the air. And then I lost the most important person. He paused. Jennifer. His voice softened, as if the name itself was a place he still wasn't ready to return to. She was the first person who ever really saw me, even when I didn't know who I was. Elijah gave a faint smile, the saddest one he'd shown all night. She didn't care if I was famous, didn't care how much money I made. We used to dream about a little house in Oregon, growing vegetables, raising a dog, and teaching a child how to be kind to the world. A silence longer than any before. She was pregnant with our first child. I remember that day like it's etched into my skin. The doctor called me into the room. Their faces said it before their mouths did. Elijah blinked quickly, but not fast enough to catch the tear that fell down his cheek. My daughter was born without a heartbeat. The entire studio froze. Marcus couldn't find words. Many in the audience lowered their heads, some clutching their chests, others wiping away tears. Elijah sighed a breath not meant to continue, but simply to survive each word. Jennifer fell apart. I tried to be strong, tried to hold her up. But the truth is, I broke too. A few weeks later, she was gone. He lifted his head not to resist the tears, but to let them fall freely. No accident, no illness, just she didn't want to stay. A faint sob escaped from somewhere in the audience, but Elijah kept going because he knew. It was silence that had nearly destroyed him all these years, and this time he couldn't let it win. I don't blame her. How could I? I'm not even sure I would have chosen to stay if I hadn't stumbled across your video. Marcus brought a hand to his mouth. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were red, and his entire body looked as if it were holding back a deep, internal tremor. Elijah looked straight at him, not with blame, not in collapse, simply as a human being recounting the moment his heart was torn open. I kept working, still walked the red carpet, still played the roles funny, strong, kind. But the truth is, I died inside that day. He exhaled again. And what I'm about to say now might be the most honest thing I've ever said in my entire career. The studio held its breath. It wasn't my career that saved me, not the fame, not therapy, but a man standing on a stage, speaking about faith as if he were talking to himself. Elijah looked at Marcus, his eyes full of quiet gratitude. And today, I just want to give that back. Elijah sat in silence, hands clasped together, eyes lowered to the lit stage floor. It seemed that after all he had just shared, there was no need to hold up an image anymore. Only the truth of who he was remained bare, tired, but real. But Marcus stayed silent, his eyes never leaving the man across from him, the man who had once been the face of a cinematic generation, now moving the entire world not with his presence, but with a silence so heavy it ached. Elijah looked up, his eyes shaded in a quiet grey. He smiled, a faint, uneven smile. People think fame means being loved more, but really, it just makes loneliness more sophisticated. That line didn't echo through the room, as sound it struck as a wave of hearts being touched in their most vulnerable places. I used to think if I had millions of fans, the pain would shrink, but the truth is, the more eyes watching, the fewer chances I had to be real. He gave a small shrug, as if each word lifted a little weight off his shoulders. Because people don't want to see a star in pain. They want to see you standing tall. They want to hear you inspire. They want to be lifted by you, but no one realizes you're falling in silence. The audience fell still, not because they didn't understand, but because they understood all too well. I've sat in rooms full of people crews, assistants, reporters, directors, and felt like a shadow. He inhaled, his hands tightening into fists, and I've stood on stages flooded with lights and still felt cold, like I was somewhere no one could hear me breathe. Marcus furrowed his brow, his lips pressed together. not to hold back tears, but as if he were holding back everything he'd never dared to say, because he, too, had lived that way. Elijah let out a soft laugh, short and sad. I learned to act not just on camera, but in life. I acted like I was okay. I acted like I was funny. I acted like I was the kind of man everyone wanted to be. But when I get home, lights off, doors closed, I'm left alone. He paused for a moment, then looked Marcus straight in the eyes. And what hurts me the most isn't losing Jennifer. It's not the child who never got to be born. It's that there's no one to truly tell their story. Those words needed no emphasis, no soundtrack. They fell into the room like a single drop of water, simple, yet resonating far beyond. I used to look in the mirror and wonder if the person staring back was still me. Not because I didn't recognize the face, but because those eyes no longer reflected anyone truly alive. Elijah leaned back slightly and sighed. Many people tell me, "You're so strong to still be standing after everything." They think I made it through by sheer will, but they don't know. Sometimes I stand up only because there's no one left to sit down with me. A soft sob rose from the audience. Some covered their faces. Others reached out and held the hands of those beside them. Marcus bowed his head, his hand still resting at his neck where the cross lay quietly, a silent witness to the entire story. Elijah looked at him this time. His gaze was no longer that of someone feeling grateful, but of two people truly seeing each other. And that's why your video was different from anything I had ever heard before. He tilted his head, his voice softening. It didn't try to make me stronger. It didn't preach, didn't rally. It just said, "I know you're hurting." And I've been there. That very voice, that's what made me feel less alone. Even though I was by myself, even though you never knew who I was. Elijah placed a hand over his chest where his heart was still beating slowly, but surely. You didn't need to know me to save me. You only needed to be honest with yourself. And that was something I had never received from anyone. Marcus looked up. They held each other's gaze. Neither spoke, because in that moment words were the most unnecessary thing. Two men, two journeys, one connection, no introduction needed. Just one person daring to be real, so the other wouldn't have to be alone in their own pretending. The entire audience was now bathed in a soft, gentle light, not from the stage lamps, but from a deep, profound listening that made it seem as if everyone was sitting in that very dark room Elijah had once been in. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his hand still resting on his chest, his fingers gently twisting the worn silver cross out of habit from long before fame. Then he spoke slowly, gently, and very humanly. You speak about pain so honestly, but in all that you've shared, there's one thing that's always present but remains unspoken. Elijah tilted his head, his eyes as if listening with his entire soul. Marcus continued, I want to ask this not as a host, but as someone who's been desperate, who stood on the edge of the abyss, just like you. He paused briefly, then asked, not loudly, but with great weight. Did you hear God in that silence? That question didn't ring out like a religious ritual. It was more like a whisper from one survivor to another to see if anyone had ever heard anything in the silence. Elijah didn't answer right away. He bowed his head, hands resting on his thighs, fingers intertwined. A long silence passed, long enough to make many hold their breath, but just right, so that when he looked up, his eyes no longer held that guarded expression. "Yes," Elijah said, without hesitation. One word, soft, but it opened an entire door. For a long time, I didn't call it God, because I was afraid of judgment, afraid of misunderstanding, afraid to believe in something I couldn't control. He exhaled softly, as if letting go of a piece of his final mask. But in that darkness, when there were no voices, no encouragement, nothing to hold on to, I still felt something. Marcus whispered, what Elijah answered not as a story, but as a confession, a presence, not loud, no light, no knocking, but real. He looked directly at Marcus, his gaze steady. I didn't hear a voice, but I felt something, like an unnamed tenderness, like someone sitting beside me, not saying a word, but never leaving. There were nights when I thought I would end it all. But right then, out of nowhere, I just heard a voice in my head say, "Not yet." Elijah looked up at the ceiling, then closed his eyes. At the time, I thought I was imagining it. But later, when I lived a little longer, I began to understand that wasn't my voice, because I didn't want to live anymore. It came from somewhere else, and it held me back. Marcus nodded softly, said nothing, because sometimes the deepest empathy doesn't come from words. It comes from a presence without judgment. Elijah continued, his voice trembling slightly, not from weakness, but because he was stepping into a sacred part of himself. I started to realize that faith isn't the uplifting feeling you get singing hymns. It's not the solemn ceremonies. It's what remains when everything else has fallen away. It's what makes you stand up, even when no one is beside you. It's what makes you breathe, even when you're not sure you want to live. It's what makes you feel you're not left behind. The audience dared not move. Many quietly wiped away tears. A middle-aged woman held her daughter's hand tightly. A young man in the back bowed his head, hands covering his face. Elijah looked around for the first time since the show began, his gaze reaching beyond the studio walls. His voice echoed through every row of seats. If you've ever sat in a dark room, thought you had nothing left to hope for, felt like the silence was swallowing you whole, then I want you to know you're not crazy. You're not broken, and you're not alone. He turned back to Marcus, and his voice deepened, because in that silence I heard the truest thing I've ever known. Marcus whispered, "What was it?" Elijah smiled, not to hide anything, but because finally he could say it out loud, that I am still loved, even when no one knows I exist. Elijah's final words, that I am still loved, even when no one knows I exist, lingered in the air like a quiet prayer, leaving the entire studio in complete silence. Marcus sat motionless, his hands clasped together, lips gently pressed as if holding back an emotion too immense to be spoken. Elijah sat across from him, no longer shy. In the soft light, he looked like a man who had just shed a heavy cloak after many years not defensive, not guarded. Just a human being, ready to face a final truth. Then he leaned slightly toward Marcus. His voice lowered, not from weakness, but because the words he was about to say weren't for performance. They were to relive. Marcus, there's something I've never told anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I never met anyone worthy of hearing it. Marcus looked up, eyes unblinking. Elijah exhaled softly, his hands intertwined on his lap. Then he spoke in a restrained but powerful voice. You don't know this, but the video you made back then, the very video that saved my life, not only touched my heart, it changed the way I saw the entire world. He paused, then continued. At the time, I didn't know your name. All I knew was a man with a silver necklace, a slightly trembling voice, standing on a stage, speaking words that I thought no one dared to say. Elijah lowered his head, took a deep breath, then looked up, locking eyes with Marcus. And I know today, I need to say those words again, not to thank you, but to remind you. Marcus furrowed his brow slightly. A mix of surprise and gentle fear flickered in his eyes as if sensing something about to come. Elijah's tone grew serious, soft but full of conviction. I know you once thought, I'm just a comedian. I'm just saying a few inspirational things. I'm just trying to live kindly in this world. But Marcus, you did more than that. He leaned forward, continuing this time slower, clearer. You thought you were having a conversation, but you were preaching. You thought you were just making people laugh. But you were lighting up the lamps that had just gone out. Marcus brought a hand to his mouth. His eyes began to redden. You thought you were just a host with a bit of faith, Elijah said. But I believe you're a disguised pastor. Those words fell like a single drop, breaking the surface of a still lake. No one reacted. No forced laughter. No murmurs. Only Marcus raising his hand to clutch the cross on his chest, as if for the first time in his life. He truly understood why he had always worn it. Elijah nodded softly. I'm not saying this because of religion. I say it because of faith. Because I once sat in darkness, unseen, unheard. But your video was the only sermon that made me feel I was still held. A tear slid slowly down Marcus's cheek, unashamed. Elijah looked at him, this time with eyes, no longer inspired, but inspiring. And today, I'm not just here to tell my story. I'm here to give back what you once gave unconditionally. Marcus opened his mouth as if to say something, but then closed it. He placed his hand over his chest where his heart was beating so real and whispered, I'm listening. Elijah took a deep breath, and in that moment there was no stage, no cameras, no television show. There were just two men and a truth about to come into the light. Marcus remained motionless, clutching the silver cross at his chest as if it were the only thread tying him to the present. Across from him, Elijah seemed to become another person, not a guest, not an actor, but a witness, a survivor, carrying the sacred thing that had saved his life and now returning to give it back. Elijah looked at Marcus. No smile, no dramatics, just a steady gaze. You don't remember everything you said in that video, but I do. Every word, every breath. Marcus exhaled sharply. One hand covered his mouth, the other clenched tightly around the cross. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the man who had saved him without ever knowing it. I'm going to say those words again, Marcus, not to remind you of the past, but to illuminate the present. He took a deep breath. God doesn't always call the qualified. Elijah began, his voice deep but resonant, as if he were not just repeating a phrase, but summoning something sacred. He qualifies the called. The words rang out like a declaration from a mountain, no amplification needed, yet powerful enough to shake the soul. Tears streamed down Marcus's face. Elijah continued, "You said God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, even if you think you're just telling jokes, just paying bills, just trying to make it to tomorrow. God might be using that very thing to change someone's life." Elijah paused, his eyes blazing, not with stage lights' glow, but with a light only found in those who have fallen into the abyss and been pulled up by a hand they couldn't see. "Marcus, I know that video was just a moment for you, but for me, it's the reason I'm still sitting here today." Marcus lowered his head. His shoulders trembled slightly. Elijah gently raised his hand, pointing to the cross on Marcus's chest. "I remember clearly. You didn't just speak with words. You placed your hand over your heart, right on that cross. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't a TV show. It was a testimony." He continued this time, no longer as if reading, but as if bringing back to life that sacred moment from years ago. "Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and sometimes your comedy is just the disguise God uses to send people hope." Marcus bowed his head, tears falling freely, not from weakness, but because it had been so long since anyone reminded him of the very reason he started. Elijah sat quietly, giving Marcus time. Then he spoke, voice softer but filled with power. "You thought you were just doing a show, but in truth, you were doing ministry. You don't wear a pastor's robe. You don't stand behind a pulpit. But your words, they went straight into my heart, deeper than any sermon I've ever heard." He paused, one hand resting over his chest, eyes locked on Marcus. "You might think you're just trying to live well, but I believe you're being used to hold on to people like me, people who are about to give up." A silence followed. Not hesitation, but sacredness. Elijah bowed his head, then whispered softly, "I don't know if God chooses anyone, but if he does, I think he chose you the night you recorded that video, and I am living proof of that." Marcus looked up, eyes red and watery, lips moving, but no words came. Elijah placed both hands on his thighs, sat upright, and spoke the final line like an indelible mark. "You once said, if you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet." He smiled, his eyes shimmering, bright like a star breaking through the clouds. "So today, I'm here to say that again to you, because, Marcus, he's not finished with you either." The moment Elijah finished saying, "He's not finished with you either," those words fell into the space like a drop of pure water, landing right onto a soul that had long since dried up. The entire audience was swallowed by a silence so profound. You could hear the slow breaths of those trying to hold back tears. Marcus sat motionless. His hand still rested over his chest, where the small silver cross lay quietly, unpretentious, without any shine or flash, but from now on, it was no longer just an accessory. It was a reminder. He blinked repeatedly, not because of the harsh stage lights, but because something inside him was overflowing, and there was no way to hold it back anymore. Elijah said nothing more. He sat quietly, giving Marcus space. A gentle silence, one only those who have touched rock bottom know how to offer. A few seconds later, Marcus shook his head slightly. He gave a soft, trembling smile. Then he whispered, "Why me?" That question escaped not as a complaint, but as a confession, small, yet heavy. Elijah did not answer. He waited, because he knew that question didn't need an explanation. It needed the one who asked it to be seen. Marcus lifted his head. His eyes were red. But this time, he did not look away. "I used to tell others, God can use anyone. But I never believed that for myself." He smiled bitterly. "Me, a comedian, a man who's fallen, failed in marriage, once thought about disappearing." Marcus gripped the cross at his chest, his hand trembling slightly. "I was never trained to be a pastor, never studied theology, never thought I was clean enough or worthy enough." Elijah nodded slowly, then spoke, his voice deep but steady. "And that's exactly why you were chosen." Marcus looked stunned. Elijah continued, "God doesn't choose the perfect to do his sacred work. He chooses those who have been broken because they know what pain sounds like. He doesn't choose those who only know how to stand on a pulpit. He chooses those who have sat on the floor and know how to help someone stand back up. He doesn't use light to call someone's name. He uses wounds. And Marcus, your wounds have become a calling, one you didn't even realize." Marcus clenched his fists. He turned toward the audience but didn't focus on any one face. His eyes swept over silent faces, many shedding tears before returning to Elijah. "I used to think, if I helped others, I wouldn't need to heal myself." He lowered his head, tears falling into the palms of his hands. "I used to believe, if I made people laugh, I wouldn't need to cry anymore." Elijah nodded. This time, his whole body leaned toward Marcus. "But the truth is, those who heal others also need healing." Marcus closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell, not because of the stage, not from fleeting emotion, but because a door inside was opening for the first time in years. Elijah looked straight at him. His voice softened, but every word felt carved into the hearts of those listening. You're not a pastor because you're perfect. You're a pastor because you know how to sit with those who have fallen without needing to preach. A soft sob echoed from the back rows, but Marcus didn't turn around. He kept his gaze fixed on Elijah as if, for the first time in his life, he dared to believe in something he had always only spoken to others. "You asked. Why me?" Elijah whispered. "I don't know all the reasons, but I know this." He placed a hand over his heart. "If your video saved even one person, then it was meaningful enough to exist. And I am that person." Marcus raised his hand to cover his face. His shoulders trembled not from shame, but because he was finally able to fall safely. Elijah sat upright, his eyes full of warmth. "And if you've ever forgotten the value of what you're doing, then today I'm here to remind you, because even ministers need someone to believe in them too." Marcus remained seated, head bowed, hand covering his face, his shoulders shaking with each breath. This was not defeat. It was surrender. Surrendering the cloak of strength, letting go of the role of guide he had worn for so many years, even while he himself was lost. Elijah said nothing more. He just sat there like a quiet guardian beside someone breaking down, not out of weakness, but from holding on too long. A silence stretched on. But unlike any other silence, this one was healing. It didn't suffocate. It made everyone witnessing it feel as if they too were being healed. Then Marcus looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, but bright. He took a breath as if, for the first time in his life, he wasn't breathing to carry on the show, but to live true to what he believed. Elijah met his gaze, a look warm as morning sunlight, yet deep as the ocean. Marcus stood up. No one told him to. No one asked. He just couldn't sit still another second while his heart urged him to step out of his shell. Elijah rose as well quietly, without drama. Two men, two different journeys now stood face to face. Not an actor and a host, not a star and a presenter, but a man who was saved and a man who never knew he had saved someone. Elijah took a step toward Marcus, then opened his arms without a word. Marcus didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, and they embraced. Not a polite hug, not a staged television moment, but a hug between two souls once broken, once silent, once alone, now finding a sacred connection. The audience rose to their feet. No applause, no cheers. They stood as people do when something sacred enters the room. A woman placed her hand over her heart. A young man bowed his head, tears falling. A couple squeezed each other's hands tighter because they all knew this wasn't the emotional part of the show. This was the reason the show existed. Elijah whispered, his voice trembling but steady. "I don't know how I can ever repay you, but I know this moment is something I will carry for the rest of my life." Marcus didn't respond with words. He just squeezed tighter. In that space, between the stage lights and the reverent silence, something deeply sacred was being reborn. Then Marcus slowly turned, facing the audience, his eyes still wet, his voice hoarse but clear. "I've stood on many stages, received many awards, made a lot of people laugh. He looked at Elijah, then back to the camera. But this moment is the greatest gift I've ever received. The entire audience fell silent. Then a soft sob echoed, then another, not from sadness, but because someone had been healed without medicine, without doctors, just by the truth. Marcus nodded softly, then whispered just loud enough for the microphone to catch, "Let's pray." No one closed their eyes. No one made the sign of the cross. But everyone nodded, because they knew this was no longer television. This was life. Marcus sat down. Elijah did too. Two men, two lives that once seemed unrelated, now sitting side by side, no more words needed, because the most important words had been spoken, and the most important understanding had been heard with the heart. On the screen, it was no longer the Marcus Dean show with its usual Q&A segments. No opening music, no movie trailers, no jokes that made the audience cheer loudly. There was only truth. Marcus looked at the audience, not with the eyes of a host, but with the eyes of someone who had just been led. He breathed softly and said, "I used to think my mission was to help others be stronger. But today I realize, sometimes, the real mission is having the courage to be vulnerable in front of those trying to keep going." He glanced at Elijah and they both smiled, no longer hiding anything. Marcus turned back to the audience. "I don't know where you are as you watch this. Maybe in your living room, maybe during a long shift, maybe in the middle of a sleepless night. But if you're feeling empty, exhausted, if you've ever thought, 'No one understands me,' if you've ever asked yourself, 'Am I worthy of continuing?'" He paused, his voice deepening but clear as a bell ringing in the night. "Then I want you to remember this. You are still here, and that is proof that your story isn't over yet." Elijah placed his hand over his chest, where his heart had once thought it wouldn't beat for another tomorrow. He nodded. "We don't have to be perfect to be loved. We don't have to be strong all the time. We don't have to have answers for everything. We just need to be honest. And sometimes it only takes one person daring to speak the truth to light up an entire room." The audience nodded, not a mere polite agreement, but nodding through tears, through trust, through letting go. Marcus leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on his knees. His voice was no longer a sound. It was a heartbeat. "I don't know how many people I'll change after this show." He looked into the camera as if staring straight into the heart of every viewer. "But if there's even one person, just one, who after watching this episode chooses to stay, chooses to believe again, or simply chooses to take just one more step, then tonight, everything we shared has been worth it." Elijah bowed his head. He spoke softly, as if sending a blessing straight into the quiet space. "Someone once saved me, with words he didn't even know were saving. And if today I can save someone else with the story I once kept hidden, then that's a miracle I never dared to hope for, but have been given." Marcus nodded, then spoke the final line like the close of a short prayer. "We can't change everything, but we can hold each other. And sometimes all it takes is one word, one look, one video, one hand, One person. He turned to Elijah. Elijah nodded. Together they whispered, almost in the same breath. Just one is enough. The stage lights dimmed. The music did not start immediately. The scene did not cut. There were only two men sitting quietly, as if they knew a miracle had just happened. No special effects needed, no gimmicks, no script, because it comes from truth. And sometimes the truth is the only thing that can save us from ourselves. If you've ever stepped into a room and felt no one truly sees you, if you've ever smiled while your heart quietly breaks, if you've ever thought, I have to be strong because no one has time to see me weak, then this story, this is for you. Because sometimes a stranger with just a few sincere words can save someone standing on the edge. And sometimes it's you, with just a small act of sharing, who can do that for someone else. If this story touches you, please leave a comment below. Please share this video with someone who needs a reminder. You are not invisible, you are not broken, and you are still loved even when the world forgets you for a moment. Because maybe you will be the reason someone chooses to stay one more day. Thank you for listening. And if you believe that truth, kindness, and faith still have a place in this world, please hit like, please subscribe, and join us as we continue to shine a light on the stories the world is waiting to hear.